So speaking of stars, you just became a GitHub star. What is a GitHub star and like what does that actually entail?
Yeah. I always struggle to answer this question because I mentioned that I don't feel like I belong in a lot of these rooms. And the stars program is definitely one of those areas where it's like, oh man, that what an all-star cast. Haha. The puns aren't gonna stop, you know. So the GitHub Stars program is a GitHub calls uses the terms community leaders and influential engineers or whatever exact terminology they use. And the idea is that if you contribute to like enough open source projects, big enough open source projects, and you remain committed and you're able to help lead a community, you know, big or small, you're a GitHub star. There's 88 of us, I think. Like there were just two of us, including myself, that were added, and yeah, we in practical terms, we hang out in a community chat, and we actually it's pretty quiet actually. We chat about a couple things here and there, but other than that, it's a good way to get feedback from the people who are pretty active on GitHub, and hopefully make the platform better.
That's really awesome.
Yeah.
I guess, thinking of like influential people, there's not a whole lot of people who in their life write books. And I'm curious to hear a little bit more about yours, about like, just more details about it. But sort of before that, I want to hear about like how you thought that like, oh yes, I want to write a book, or like, oh yes, this is like an obvious sort of thing to do, or whatever your thought process was for getting there.
Yeah, so I started with Angular, and I remember my boss at the time was super supportive of me because so he had found me through my open source projects, and he saw that I was in the city, and he was like, Corbin, come on in. I was like a 17-year-old, and he was like, come into the office and like let's interview. And I remember I had never done Angular before, never really done web dev before, so I followed a tutorial, and I showed him the tutorial, and I'm like, look, I followed it, and I don't know what I'm doing. Please hire me. And he did. I don't know why he hired me, but he did. And he kind of threw like a month at me where I was like, go learn as much as you can, have fun. Feel free to expense if it's within a reasonable cost measure, and just learn as much as you humanly can absorb, and then go from there. And I did. And I think that really trained how I learned like software engineering, is this idea of like, okay, I have to absorb it like rapidly. I have to absorb it, like the industry moves quickly, especially in web dev. Like we have to get on top of this. And I remember I was starting to look for another job after a couple of years at that company. And I'd only done Angular before, and I was like, I hear this React thing is popping off. I hear about Vue. I hear about these other technologies. What are they? So I start learning them, and I'm like, yo, these aren't that different. Like they have differences. Don't get me wrong, especially nowadays. But like, back when it was class components for React, you could kind of learn things here and there and get by, especially from Angular, which also use classes. So I started keeping a little notebook in GitHub Gist, actually, a private GitHub Gist of a comparison table of which syntax did what in each framework. And I don't know, it had like 30, maybe 35 rows by the end of it. And I had managed to get a job at Hilton doing React after that, and, built a few projects using Vue just for fun. And as I left that boot camp from earlier story, I started writing. And my first blog post was about like Angular internals and how to read the source code and how it works. And then I started writing a little bit about React as I got more involved with this. And next thing I knew, I'm like, I've written the length of a book. Like I've written like I think now it's like 150,000 words. And I'm like, why don't I just write that? Like I've always been wanting this guide that would help you learn one framework from another framework's purview. Why not write that? Like that doesn't exist anywhere. Like nowadays we have Component Party, which is awesome. Shout out Component Party. But that's not really a step-by-step guide. You know what I mean? Like that doesn't teach the fundamentals. That doesn't teach the concepts. It's just, boom, there's a syntax. So I just figured, why not? Let's see how far we can get. Now I'm getting ready to publish the thing.
That's really awesome. So like, tell us a little bit more about the structure of this. So you're sort of guiding readers through not just comparisons of frameworks, but like how to build components and things with different frameworks and how to map their mental model from one framework to the other. So, like, which frameworks are you covering? Generally curious about that. And also, do you have like specific parts of the book that are just like, oh, well, before we start talking about frameworks, let's talk about like the component model or something and like what these things are? Or do you really just try to focus on the aspect of like, here's this framework that you may know, and here's the mental model, and then here's how we convert it to like this other framework?
Yeah, so great questions. Let me give like a super quick pitch for the book, answer the first common question that I get usually, and then kind of lead it into what we're talking about. So the book that I'm writing is called The Framework Field Guide. It's actually a trilogy of books because I don't like myself very much. And the trilogy teaches React, Angular, and Vue all at once. Some people ask the question like, okay, well, does one book teach one and then the next book? No. We teach React, Angular, and Vue in the first book. And then we teach the ecosystem like Next.js and Redux and, like any of the community tools in the second book. And then in the third book, I'm rewriting the frameworks from scratch and teaching you how to do it. So that's going to be the trilogy. The first book is the one that I'm talking about almost launching. So I still have quite a bit of work ahead of me. And to your point, the first book is really meant to be, you've maybe done a for loop in JavaScript, you've maybe done an if statement in JavaScript, and you've done some HTML and CSS. And even if you haven't done those things, I provide resources that are in the prerequisites chapter that explain, what it is that you need to read beforehand. And from that point, I start talking about the component model. I introduce how to render, input outputs. But I try to focus on the conceptual aspect of it rather than the syntax. And I think that that's the only way that my book was able to work, is that the three have very different syntaxes and some different underlying methods, but the fundamental nuances are fairly similar, right? If you're dealing, one of my chapters, you may know lifecycle methods, right? This idea that when a component renders, so on and so forth. But that's not really what lifecycle methods are for. Lifecycle methods are for side effects, right? So let's not talk about lifecycle methods. In fact, I barely even use the word lifecycle methods throughout the whole book. Instead, I talk about side effects and side effect manipulation and what a side effect is outside of the concept of a framework. And then I bring it back into the framework. And here's how you add an event listener manually. Here's why you would want to do that. Here's how you do cleanup. Here's what happens if you don't do cleanup. Here's how it'll actually impact your production code. Now build your own thing yourself. And that's the type of fundamental, concept building that I want to focus on in these books.
So as you're going, are you actually building with each framework?
Yeah. So at the end of so I have code samples, right? That are in each of the three frameworks that show you how to build whatever I'm talking about. And then at the end of each chapter, I have a challenge that'll recap what you've learned in that chapter and all the previous chapters, and will let you build a practical application, the same application throughout all chapters. And then you'll have something working at the end. The challenge there is, of course, how do you keep one application going through the whole thing, which has been fun to explore. But I've managed to do it somehow.
I feel like the challenge would also be, since the second chapter you said is meta frameworks, if you start from a place of no meta frameworks, like getting React set up and rendering on a web page, it's not the simplest thing. And so you kind of have this weird chicken and egg problem where it's I want to use the batteries included thing that just gets me going, but I don't know what I'm doing. So how do you contend with that?
So I really struggled with that. The other challenging one is, how do I deal with backend, right? If I'm not introducing backend tools, how do I deal with the fetch API? Do I use someone else's API that might break and then overload their, that's not cool. So I've made two kind of controversial decisions in this book, which is how you pitch a book for sure, right? You talk about all the bad things about it. The first one is that I don't introduce build tooling at all. I don't talk about Vite, don't talk about Webpack, don't talk about just none of it. Instead, I'm deferring to web IDEs. So, here's the syntax, get it up and running. The build tooling will come in the second book, right? Which is a weird decision. That's a chicken and egg problem, just like you're talking about. But I thought it made more sense to start with the concepts rather than here's 100 pages on how to set up Webpack, which is I could do that, but I don't know that you'd want to read that and get started with it, The second controversial decision is that I don't use fetch or XHR or any kind of network request anywhere in the book, at least the first book. Second book will be just littered, which is absolutely like every chapter everywhere. But I wanted to make sure that you understand, not you, but the reader understood that you can build an application without a backend. Now you're limited, of course, right? But if you're just trying to learn and you want to understand the fundamentals, the best way to do that is to look at it in its entirety, but on its own, in my opinion. You get the whole picture without kind of muddying the water of where the lines are and what is what. So I really tried to focus just on the frameworks themselves as opposed to the holistic web development picture.
That's really cool. I mean, I think this is a good choice because there is a lot of distraction in the ecosystems about just getting set up. So if you're trying to learn a framework and you're trying to learn meta frameworks and you're trying to learn build tools and you're trying to learn all these things, it can be really paralyzing. Mm-hmm. So sort of a follow-up question just about the format of the book. So, I mean, I'm assuming that this has to be sort of digital as a medium, or does it? Question mark.
So it is digital. And I mentioned earlier, it's free. You don't have to sign in. You don't have to log in. In fact, we don't have a login system. So I don't know. Like our most tracking is some simple page analytics. So, outside of that, I am planning on doing a physical release. What I've done is I've written the whole book in Markdown with some special compiler flags embedded in the Markdown. And we're just going to render each of the tabs as headings, right? So anytime you see a React heading, you'll know that you're focusing on that code snippet, and then Angular and Vue. So we will have a physical copy at some point. I've got to figure out the logistics of that. And this is my promise to y'all. Any profits that I make from the physical copy will go right to charity, whether that is Girls Who Code, whether that's any organization that can help people learn how to code. Profits will go to charity.
That's really awesome. That's very good of you.
I'm adverse to money. I'm just allergic to it. No, unironically, like I'm very, very privileged and fortunate to be in the career that I am, and I'm fine. I'm comfortable. Why do I need the extra whatever amount that could go towards helping others,
So let's talk a little bit about the frameworks themselves. So you've mentioned that they're similar in a few different respects, but like, how are they similar? And then I'd say a little more interesting, like how do they differ the most? Like which one has goes the most off the beaten path?
Yeah. So I think that this question is really interesting. I've done a few podcasts where I talk about this, and every time I talk about it, I feel like the ecosystem changes. You know what I mean? Like our understanding of hooks change and evolve over time, but then like Angular will just be like, here's signals, have fun with that, and make me want to rewrite my book. That's gonna be fun. So what do they share? Let's start with that. Obviously the component model, right? So you have the ability to componentize. The way that my book introduces it is that each website is built out of scaffolding, which is HTML. It's built out of styling, which is CSS, and then it's built out of logic, which is JavaScript, right? So if we think about a component in its most like pure form, it's really just consolidating those three and allowing you to modularize how you apply those three within that idea of being consolidated. So you can mix and match, and you can move a sidebar off to this side, and it should just ideally work in isolation of everything else, right? They share input output systems. They share some method of dealing with side effects, as we talked about earlier. They tend to share reactivity, which is when you change something in JavaScript state, it'll then be reflected in the DOM. They share, some form of rendering mechanism, whether that is a virtual DOM, whether that's an incremental DOM. There is some method in which your code is then processed to be shown on screen, right? That's I feel like that's like 90% of it. The rest is implementation detail and additional concepts. But they have component hierarchy. You have the ability to access children. You really are able to do very equivocal things, maybe not exact, but very equivocal things throughout all three. At least of the frameworks I'm talking about. They differ pretty broadly based on what of those topics we're talking about, right? I hinted at one of them, which is the incremental DOM for Angular versus a virtual DOM for Vue and React. There's the difference in how, the explicit re-rendering of React versus the implicit reactivity of Vue versus the whatever Zone.js is doing Angular. Just patch all the things. It's fine. So it's definitely interesting to see that contrast between those, even within that similarity.